So first off, Ben, I really want to thank you for doing this program for the library. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Um,
having me.
we are here to honor the life of Jacob Birnbaum and all the victims of the Shoah. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about your grandfather, Jacob Birnbaum. Can you summarize the plot of Jacob's memoir for anyone who hasn't read it?
Sure. I mean, it's a really miraculous story. He went through 6 different camps during the years of 1942 and 1945. And I mean, but he explains in the book how it was a gradual progression where basically things were getting, he grew up in Pietrków, Poland, which is a small town, and it was very different than America, but there was already a lot of anti-Semitism, but then at one point it just, they had to start wearing armbands before, they had to sew Jewish stars in their clothes. The story really starts shortly before on his 20th birthday, when he's taken away from his parents who would never see him again. His only possession was a few photos. He tried to hide for as long as he could, but they had like drag nets. They were going and trying to find all the Jews and put them in this collection area where they ended up shipping many of them to labor camps. And the ones who didn't go to labor camps later would be sent to the death camps. In his first camp, he described it as being, it was bad, but it only got worse. There, at least he was able to organize, which he said was a very crucial element, something that he started doing from the beginning, trying to make, and not organize in the sense of how we think of organizing now. Organizing was making connections, doing anything you can do to, scavenge for food, being strategic. And that worked at first, but then he got transferred. He even, at that first camp, Anhalt Bay, Auschwitz, which was just outside of Auschwitz, he ended up dropping a brick on a German guard's boot, but offered him, his father made shoes, so he offered him new shoes, and he ended up having a relationship that helped him get through that first camp without too cruel treatment. But the next camp that he ended up getting sent to was the guards were trained to be incredibly cruel to the Jews. He had to work in freezing cold weather, wearing almost, nothing but rags. And at some point he got so weak that he pretty much lost the will to go on. And he just, they were doing back-breaking labor, shoveling dirt, hard-packed dirt into lorries for 14 hours a day in the freezing cold with no breaks or anything, and hardly any food. So eventually he fainted, and they sent him to a third camp, Ludwigsdorf, which was, he didn't realize it, but it was a death camp deep in the Carpathian Mountains where they were making explosive munitions for the German forces, but the chemicals poisoned everybody who worked there to death. He even described people were digging graves, and then those people would become too sick, and then the graves would be dug for them, which was just horrible. And he thought that might be the end. In fact, before that happened, he almost got sent to Auschwitz, but just by really dumb luck, he ended up getting transferred here where he at least had a chance, but he knew he had to get out of there because everybody had I think it was about 6 weeks of getting poisoned by the chemicals before their body they couldn't eat, they wouldn't be able to get up anymore. And it was actually like, he couldn't get up anymore. And even though he had his pictures trying to remind him who he was starting to really lose the will to live. But then it was actually, he offered a capo, I always forget how to, capo, who came in, he offered him his dental supplies just to be able to drag him to the shower because he was too weak to get up. And just from that ice cold shower, he said it was the greatest shower he ever had in his life. He found the will. I remember
that part, yeah.
Yeah. he found the will to keep going on, and then basically volunteered himself when the next shipment came. When they asked for a transfer, he didn't know if his name was called, but he just stepped forward, and he got sent to another camp where he was able to recover, even though that was Graditz. That was the 4th camp, and it was just terrible conditions, lots of disease, but he was able to, just by again dumb luck, getting transferred to another camp, working at a 5th camp, Langenbielau, where he actually, the treatment wasn't quite as bad. And it's good that he got out when he did, because shortly after there was a typhoid outbreak at Graditz, and everybody there was exterminated. And that might sound like a terrible word to use, exterminate, but that was how it was.
That's what happened.
And in the 5th camp in Langenbielau, he basically was there because of a passive-aggressive fight between the German guards and one of the businessmen there. You know, there was infighting even in the Nazi party and the German government. And then he was able to work there for a while, but even though it was better, he ended up getting pneumonia and was legally declared dead. His heart had moved all the way from, where it should be, to his stomach, just because of all the fluids that it was filled with. But then another miracle, he recovered, and his heart slowly began moving back. They actually embarrassed the doctor by making him try to keep him alive, and they studied him as like a medical project. His heart, over the course of several weeks, actually slowly moved back to its normal location. And then the final camp, he was at the sports school. They knew that the war was ending, but still the Jews were getting put on these death marches, and one of his tasks was he had to shovel the bodies and that were all along the path to into a specific area. But
Ethan's avoiding us. Was it
but at
something
that-
that we did? I
but it
didn't
was
know
at that
that.
point.
I'm sorry. Can you please can everyone make sure they're muted? Thank you so much.
But that was finally the point where they realized that the Germans were on the defensive. He got to go free, but it was in the 5th camp he actually met. There was one day where the guards, they went to go to church, and to try to keep their spirits up after the whole incident with the heart, he kind of became a hero because there was so little hope. He was known as the man with the moving heart. And I think after that happened, he really realized he was an inspiration to people. He started to write poetry. He ended up organizing to get everything they could to have a small Passover Seder. And they also passed some over to the women's side. On the other side of a barbed wire fence, there were women singing and dancing. Even though they were in terrible condition, they realized they needed to do something to keep their spirits up. And it was there that he saw the woman who later he would find and marry. So after they were liberated, for a little while, he actually was part of a group that was supposed to track down remaining Nazis. But he realized, you would think the Holocaust basically being over, that things would be better, but there were still killings, and he realized he needed to get out of there. So him and Mira, after getting married, they embarked on a journey from Poland to Germany. And finally, he was supposed to be taken on as a dental apprentice in Washington, D.C. A little change of fate ended up bringing him to Boston, where he was able to raise a family. But he, very early on, the last letter he got from his father basically said that they knew that they were going to be going to the death camps. And it said, never let them forget what happened to us. And he made that his promise. So as soon as he got out, he made it just a mission of his life to make sure to not only pass on the story, and sadly he's no longer with us, but he even finished his book by saying that he knows that he hopes that his great great-grandchildren will continue to tell the story, because this is something that can happen again, and we need to share this story so that everybody knows.
And we have to
sadly,
see the
not a lot of
signs.
people do know.
Exactly. I'm sorry, let me just admit someone from the waiting room. Thank you so much for summarizing that for us, because unfortunately, I kept my promises out of print, and I really hope that you'll donate a copy to the library so that more people can read it, because I absolutely love the book. It was very inspirational. It was uplifting. You don't expect a story like that to be you don't expect a memoir like that to be uplifting, but it was. And, you know, I think that it's so important that we read more Holocaust accounts like your grandfather's, because there are many people who they still don't understand what really happened. According to The Guardian, for example, out of a survey of adults 18 to 39, 23% said they believed the Holocaust was a myth, had been exaggerated, or they weren't sure. So this article reveals that almost 2/3 of young American adults do not know that 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Are you shocked by this level of ignorance? How do you think that we got here? I mean, do you think it's our education system? Do you think it's just, I mean, I hate to say, do you think it's just that people are stupid? I mean, what do you think it is?
I think it's a whole bunch of factors, and it's been coming for a long period of time. I mean, sadly, most of the survivors are no longer living or in the state where they're able to share their story, their firsthand accounts. But even then, there have always been people who were deniers. I mean, that's why in Germany, Holocaust denial became a crime, because they realized this is something that has to be eradicated. Like this kind of, you know, some people don't know. Some people are knowingly spreading misinformation. And unfortunately, I think right now, we're at a time where misinformation is hard to tell from real information. And even though we think of ourselves as smart people, I think everybody can probably attest to a time where maybe they shared an article where it was the headline and they didn't read it through, and they didn't realize it was fake. But I think it's also been a lack of education. I think there's not enough education in the schools, and I think some people think, well, now that generation is gone, we don't have to, there's less pressure to tell the story, so maybe we don't need to and should focus more on things that are more current. However, I think we're seeing some of the consequences of that, because I think a lot of people forget that this was not something that happened. Hitler rose to power and he started right away. He started these camps. He was appointed chancellor in 1933, but it wasn't, the World War didn't start till 1939, and they didn't start deporting people to these labor and death camps until 1942. So it was a gradual process. And he even mentioned, he says, what happened to me, I didn't consider that to be the Holocaust, because he survived. The main thing about the Holocaust was just how it was hopeless, and it was like a factory where people were just, you know, raw materials were collected and exported, and the final product was the final solution. So there were so many stories that you don't get to hear.
Yes.
But I think that also right now, America and other countries too, we have our physical borders protected, but our digital borders are wide open. And there's a lot of intentional misspreading of information, and with attention being the big economy right now, all these companies are not thinking ethically. They're just trying to get whatever is the most salient. Yes, Facebook is a big example. And there was actually a great documentary I recently watched called The Social Dilemma, all about this, that says they're just trying to get you to keep looking at your screen so they can keep giving you advertisements. But one of the consequences of that is what ends up being one of the most captivating things are these very outrageous videos, conspiracy videos. And conspiracies always come sooner or later to anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
That's
well, like with QAnon.
And honestly, QAnon is just a repackaged Nazi ideology,
Yeah.
right down to, saying that Jewish, globalist powers are going to take your children. It's very similar to the blood libel stories that have caused Jews to be killed for centuries. So I think it is sad. It's not shocking, but I do hope that this is a wake-up call that we need to do something to reverse this, or because if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it.
Exactly. No, I definitely agree with you. I have a quote from Deborah Lipstadt, who has been writing, teaching, and speaking about the Shoah for decades. She says that the Holocaust is one of the most all-encompassing examples of state-sponsored genocide. So this is what we were just talking about. And I feel like your grandfather's memoir really illustrates this, and he puts it on a level that everyone can easily understand. And I really appreciated that about the book. I feel like reading I Kept My Promise is an exercise in empathy. So I feel like anyone who reads it, they're walking in Jacob's shoes, they're feeling what he feels, they're seeing what he sees, and he makes his experience in history understandable to the reader. And so I wonder what you feel about that.
I mean, I think, it's very relatable. And I mean, some of that might be just that he kept his language just very simple, just kind of describing matter-of-factly what happened. Because this was him recollecting what happened, decades later. But it's still something like that happens. It's all seared into his memory.
Yeah.
And he has always had a really amazing memory. But I think what kind of also makes it different is he was always an optimist, but there were so many terrible things he could focus on, and some of them of course he had to mention, but there were also he pointed out almost every single instance of people going out of their way to help him, to do good things along the way. I think it was
like the Meister.
There was that first Meister who, he had to pretend that he was yelling at Jacob saying, "Go fill this pail," when it was actually like sandwiches and letters.
Yeah.
He risked his own career and life to do that. But and even at one of the camps, they realized if someone was weak and not holding up, everybody else would work harder. There were everywhere there were people who went out of his way, and he would not have survived if it weren't for the help of those people. There was at one point he was going to go into the barracks where all the sick people went, and someone went out of their way to warn him, you can't, he said, I've lost, I don't care what happens to me. He's like, no, you know what happens. If you go in there, they're going to ship you off and you're going to die. You need to get up somehow. And sure enough, he helped him get up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that so I kind of ended up taking it in a lot of ways. It's inspirational because, the easiest thing, and he mentioned this in the book, the easiest thing to do, the safest thing to do was nothing. But there were people knowing that they're facing the prospect of punishment or death who risked their life to help other people when it served no benefit for them. And I think in a way that, it was really beautiful.
No, I think that too. And I think that it's such a memorable part of the book.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think your grandfather learned from his Holocaust experience?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think it definitely shaped who he was. To say he learned from it, I think there were certain things that he did take with him. One thing was
kind
always
that's kind of what I mean. Like, what did he like? Kind of, I'm sorry. Like, how did that shape him? I mean, obviously, you're never the same. But how did that just?
Well, I think it made it really clear to him. First of all, that he had more. I always admired that he just had incredible willpower. That he could just one day he had smoked, and then one day he found out how bad it was and said, "I'm going to stop smoking," and never did it again. And like that was nothing for him. But it's because of the like unbelievable willpower he had to exert just in order to survive. Like he would get soup and bread, and he said he needs to save something for later, not just because physically he needed to have some food to be able to work, but mentally he just needed to know that there was something to look forward to, no matter how bad things got. And he, you know, he said, like, even like to the day that he published that book, he still always left some food on his plate. He always saved, and he also just knew how important his identity is, and how, for everybody, how important your identity was, because part of what made this so hopeless and so terrible is the dehumanization, where your head was shaved, they stole everybody's clothes, you just had rags and a number, and you eventually just forgot who you were on the outside. You were just, some people resigned themselves to their death, and they became what was known as Musulman. Basically people who they kind of like had sunken, hollow eyes. They just knew they were basically walking dead. Because they knew it was coming, and they just lost all identity and some sense of self. But he wouldn't let that happen to him, because he knew once that happens, there's no recovering. And I think probably part of what allowed him to do that was two things. One was the pictures that he managed to smuggle just as the guards were taking him away. He would look at those pictures, remember his family, remember who he was, his friends back home, and that helped him. Also, he had some dental tools that, at least until he gave them away, but it got him through some of the toughest times, just remembering, you know, he had been training to be a dentist before this. He had skills, and even if he couldn't use them right now, he needed to remember who he was. And I just think that's a good reminder for everybody, because I think sometimes we can get so caught up in whatever's going on in our lives now, but it's nothing compared to this. So never be afraid to completely be yourself, and just try to always, even when things seem really bad, you can get through a lot of it if you have the right outlook and you're always trying to problem solve. Like I mentioned, he was always organizing. He was always looking for some sort of way, and he wouldn't have survived if he didn't. And hopefully, I think that later on that served him in a lot of ways, in order just getting, even becoming a dentist when he came to the United States. Everything was an uphill battle, but he managed to find ways to just create a lasting legacy.
How do you think your grandfather's memoir differs from other Holocaust memoirs, like Night by Elie Wiesel, or I Have Lived 1,000 Years by Olivia Benton-Jackson?
So I will admit that it's at least been a very long time since I've read either book, but I do remember that Night, it was semi-autobiographical, but it wasn't saying exactly what happened. It was like describing himself as a person.
It's more literary.
Right, and I think which I think makes it a very powerful book. Just sort of like how sometimes when you take a story and you adapt it to film, you have to add some embellishments. Yeah. But I think what makes it great in a way is that, you know, he wasn't a writer. He was just saying the story as he remembered it. Yeah. So it was just,
well, it's just like his like firsthand account. And I felt like this is like the absolute truth, no embellishments. Like I felt like I was really walking in his shoes completely. And I feel like it was also very historical. Like I felt like it should be taught in a history class.
Absolutely. I mean, and he also, you know, in other points of the book, you know, he described what led up to it. And I think in a way it was, I mean, I just reread it recently, and it was kind of chilling to say, even when they knew things were bad, everyone still said, it could never happen here.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that is, sometimes it's like people don't, even if they know how bad it is, it's just something that, and I also think one difference is that he doesn't just tell the story, like it doesn't end when he gets out. It's about And I think
also
it's a part of the
after.
story because it was everything was very messy after the liberation. And, you know, like he became the mayor of a small town basically because, or he's an offer because he
Yeah.
just like a lot of these towns had just been basically abandoned.
Yeah.
And I think just the whole to me, I think it was very powerful, just the realization after a pogrom happened
Yeah.
post-liberation, where they realized we're never going to be safe here. And I think that's why it just became clear that anti-Semitism isn't going to go away. It's just like a virus that's very hard to get rid of.
That
It's always
spreads.
there. Yeah, and it spreads and it needs to be contained. I mean, I think
And eradicated.
that ideally that would be the goal. Realistically, the best we can do is try to keep it contained. But
Yeah. But that actually leads into my next question. How do you think we can combat anti-Semitism?
I think it definitely it takes a multi-pronged approach. I think one right now there's just as far as news goes, it's hard to, as I mentioned earlier, it's hard to separate what's real news from what's misinformation and fake news. And I think that's something that's being exploited right now, and people's own psychological weaknesses are being exploited as a result. So I think there needs to be some sort of regulation. There used to be regulation on what could be put on a news channel and what could not, be aired on TV. And I think that had a major impact. I think also schools, I mean, I read a great book, Educated, where the main character was homeschooled and went to college not knowing what the Holocaust was at all. And the teacher got mad thinking that she was joking, but unfortunately, it is something where we do need to put pressure on the educational system, not to just to teach. And I think sometimes they just teach it in a small section in some schools, usually before we're too young to really fully process it, and then it's never discussed again.
Yeah.
And I think that's just part of American culture. We don't like to look at uncomfortable pasts because the reality was America was not innocent in this. And I think we like to portray ourselves as the heroes who came in and saved all the Jews, but that wasn't the case. It was easier for a Nazi to move to America after the Holocaust than it was for a Jew. There was still just
Operation Paperclip.
Exactly. And before the war, there were very strict quotas, so many Jews were turned away. And America didn't even decide to get involved in the war to stop Germany, even knowing the atrocities that were being committed until years later, until it started affecting them more personally. So I think that's definitely one thing, is that it just needs to be it needs to be taught in schools, but also more thoroughly and more throughout, because I think reading one book does not count as an education on a subject.
Yeah.
Especially at a time when, many people might see that as just a work of, like, they might say, oh, it could be fiction. It really needs to be driven home because there's just very important lessons to be drawn from it, and how Hitler rose to power and how a whole society that was a democratic society could completely just all coalesce to do terrible, cruel things just out of hate. I think with that being said, as we kind of alluded to earlier, there are groups on American soil right now that are pushing the same conspiracy theories and pseudoscience that was pushed by the Nazis that ended up turning people against them. And there's the same kind of, right now with the pandemic, there's a lot of the same tough economic conditions that can really foster that to spread. So we really need to take action to shout down those conspiracy theorists and do what we can to not give them a platform and eradicate them. Because unfortunately, and some people in America, we do value free speech, but hate is not free speech. So I think we really
Exactly. And
need
also,
to
like
draw
in
that.
Germany, I mean, you still have free speech, but I mean, you can't, like, swastikas are illegal,
Hmm.
and the same thing with like Holocaust denial, like we were talking about before. So I feel like, I mean, even though I'm sure far right groups exist, they have come
Yeah,
to terms with their past more than I feel like
some of them. I
we
mean, there's
have.
still,
Yeah, not every.
yeah, there's still definitely neo-Nazis in Germany, but they
Yes,
just know that
yes,
they can't, the
they
fact that they
can't.
have to, just like there will always be anti-Semites here. But
Yeah,
it's very different when people have to do it in secret because
yes,
they know that they'll be shamed, or,
yeah,
there's legal consequences
yeah,
for saying it, as opposed to if you have politicians who are openly saying it as part of their platform,
yeah,
and you know other people hear it, then it's a normalization
yeah,
of those views. It says, well, I guess maybe I had these prejudices, but I guess it's an acceptable way to think.
yeah,
And before you know it, you can go down a rabbit hole. I think right now with social media,
yeah,
it's like an echo chamber with a giant rabbit hole in the middle where people
yeah,
can easily slip down and have extreme views. So
yeah. So we're in a very slippery, very dangerous slope right now with
and I think,
yeah.
yeah, I
Sorry,
just
go
want to
ahead.
make one other point. um just that I think nowadays, I think there was a time when people would be more openly racist and anti-Semitic, but now there's a big thing about buzzwords, code words, dog whistles, things that you
Yeah,
can say, like saying that you're anti-Zionist or anti-Israel, but it's not that you respect Israel's right to exist, but you disagree with the politicians. Everybody says that's okay, but it's really, you don't want, saying anti-Israel sometimes can get conflated. There's a lot of gray area, and people sometimes take advantage of that gray area. Or saying any conspiracy involving George Soros. That doesn't mean they picked him for a reason. It's because he's a prominent Jewish person,
yeah,
and it's just to play off all those old anti-Semitic tropes.
yeah. No, and it's sorry, someone tried to, and it's really awful because he fought communism. I mean, he's done a lot of really amazing things, and I mean, I get, when you have these huge conspiracy theories, and I mean, it's they're so anti-Semitic, but it's like they pick this one person, and the one person they happen to pick, I mean, he's actually
But it's actually, it resembles something bigger, because
yeah,
hate, it ultimately comes down to white supremacists versus everyone else.
yeah,
Thus the Martin Niemöller poem, first they came for the communists, and I did not
yeah,
speak up because I was not a communist,
yeah,
et cetera, et
yeah,
cetera. I mean,
yeah,
the part of the whole conspiracy
yeah,
theory is that Jews are helping other immigrants to come in. So it's
yeah,
kind of trying to rope them all together to say
yeah,
Jews are part of this plot. And I think
yeah,
that's, so it's not just to address anti-Semitism, it's just
yeah,
to fight white supremacy
yeah,
is really ends up benefiting everybody of all races. This is something
yeah,
that, hate, it's just different flavors of hate, but it's all
yeah,
part of the same main element.
yeah. Um, I just want to check because we're at 7:39. I want to see if there's any questions in the chat. You know what? I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So we're going to continue. But if you have, if anyone in the audience has any questions for Ben, please put them in the chat, and then at the very end, I'll get to them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we'll continue, and we're going to go on to something a little more happier.
Yes.
We'll go to a
I
little
think
more
we
happier.
could use a little levity right now.
Yeah. So what are your favorite memories of your grandfather?
I would say that he loved Cape Cod. He bought that house, kind of pretty much on a whim, and it ended up just being something that he loved. So he lived in Newton, Massachusetts, but in the summers, that was where he'd stay. And I think we just loved being with him there. He was always happiest when he was there in the big hammock in the backyard. Also, I think, Judaism was a big part of his life. Like his faith was, he attests that was what really got him through. And so the Jewish holidays always just carried a whole lot of meaning, especially Passover. I think Passover, to think, he mentioned just before about a week before the guards took him away, they had the last Passover, and they said, we didn't need to dip our, we had real tears that night. We didn't need salt water. And I think its importance also came up later when they managed to get a little group of people to share their individual stories. I think this was in Lagan Bilau, where they got a group together that he organized of people to share their stories of what their lives were like on the outside before going to the camps. And they managed to scrounge up enough, matzah and other things to have, a Passover Seder. So that was something that was always very important to him. He loved to give a speech, and my uncle would always go, speech, speech, speech. And he loved, just sharing his wisdom, because the Holocaust was something like we've never seen. We've never experienced. I don't think we can really even imagine it, but it's something Passover now has the Passover Seder has a section dedicated to the Holocaust, because this was slavery that was even more cruel than Pharaoh. But I think, so there were just a lot of positive memories and also just him and his wife, Bobby. They would bicker about, they loved each other. They would always be there for each other. And when they would get into a fight, they would bicker in Yiddish, so we didn't know what they were saying.
Having survivors as grandparents, how do you think that impacted you? What did you learn from them?
I think I just learned, in some ways, just for one thing, having a strong sense of identity. And I think so this was a takeaway it was probably my favorite. I might be kind of going into another question, but my favorite part of his memoir was something that I didn't remember until I reread it. But as they were going on the train to one of the camps, he had started. So he started right after he survived the pneumonia that he thought would kill him. He started writing poetry, and I think that's just to imagine that you've just been through years of insane treatment, having almost your body being completely emaciated, to still be able to write poetry. To me, I think that's just very powerful. I know for me, creativity will always be part of my life, and I think I owe that to him, because for him it was so important. And even to the point where he would write parodies of, and this was a time where nothing funny was happening. But he would try to, write these parodies of different situations that happened that would make people laugh, that would keep their spirits up. Even to the point where they were on a train and he got together with a musician and they wrote a parody song making fun of one of the characters, the Baruch Meister, to the point where one of the capos overheard and basically said who was responsible for writing this song. And he stepped forward, then somebody else the musician stepped forward, and then everybody started stepping forward, like in that movie Spartacus. But ultimately, he admitted, okay, someone needs to be held accountable. I'll take credit. And the Baruch Meister actually said to him, "It's a pretty good song. I don't want to hear it again," which he was sure he was going to be killed. And that would have been what you would have expected. But I guess that guy had an ego, and I guess was sort of flattered that a parody, even if it was a little insulting, that a parody song had been written about him. I guess it was a good thing that he had a sense of humor.
Yeah. No, that part was because I remember reading it, and I didn't expect it, and it's funny, and you don't expect that,
Yeah.
And he's writing poetry and satire, and It's just,
Yeah, which is something that now I like doing that too, right? I mean, obviously a very different scenario, but like
yeah,
I think just not having realized, like the fact that I write comedy songs and parodies and didn't realize that my own grandfather had done that in the camps. I
yeah,
think I suddenly
yeah.
felt just like so connected to him when I made that realization.
So right now, our country is undergoing a reckoning, what you would call another civil rights movement. How do you think your grandfather, as a Holocaust survivor, would react if he was still with us?
You know, I think he would be very concerned. I think having gone through this once and seeing, you know, he described it as a storm and storm clouds gathering. I think he would be seeing the writing on the wall that things are, I think everyone can tell. I think even if you watched the debate last night, there was some moments in there where us as Americans who know democracy, I think even a lot of people on all sides of the aisle said, this is scary. This, you're starting to see these clues to moving possibly to something much more fascist, more violent. And I think that's, I think that he would definitely realize that, you know, hate, it's something that does need to be stamped out. And I think he would be fighting, like throughout his life, he was mostly focused on telling his story, the story of other Jewish people who had gone through the Holocaust. But I think he also would recognize that we all need to work together. We need, you know, in order to fight this, because nobody can do it alone. We need to hear stories of Black families that went through slavery, that went through Jim Crow, that right now there's people who are, you know, there was just forced hysterectomies in migrant camps. There's things that are very scary.
Yeah.
And I think, and it's happened, I think nobody, you know, no minority is safe in that regard. So I think he would be very concerned, and I think he would be on the front lines, were he alive today, trying to fight it, trying to raise awareness, because he knows how easy it is for something like this to happen again if you don't fight it.
That's very good to hear. Very reassuring.
Okay.
Do you want to add something?
Sure. Well, I see that Alice Pernick sent us a question saying my grandfather would be very proud of me. There are important lessons for today. Is there any thought of getting the book back into publication? Unfortunately, the book isn't going to be going back into publication, but I do have a few copies. I would take an $18 donation that would be sent to the Holocaust Museum in Washington in his memory. Unfortunately, we do have a limited amount of copies, but I think it's of utmost importance that the story continues to get shared. So I'm going to try to do what I can to keep, even though we don't have a lot of books left, I want to do what I can. And I think I thank you for this program, because I think it's one of the ways that we can continue to keep this story. And I hopefully I can at least get a few copies available. Just find a way to make it more accessible, because I want everyone to see the story, because I think until you read it, you know, I've even had friends who did not think that they would be able to handle it or read, and they read right through it and said it like it was just an incredible story, and they're really glad that they read it.
If anyone else has any more questions, please put them in the chat. Oh, Gail says she would like to purchase your grandfather's book.
Okay, well, great. Well,
I'm not sure there's enough copies.
Well, I know. I think, well, at least a few, because like we said, we'd take that $18 donation to send to the Holocaust Museum in Washington in his memory, because I think that would help them share the story.
Ben, do
There
you want to
also
put your
is,
email in the chat for people
yes,
so they can contact you?
yeah, I think that's probably the best way. You can contact me at, I'll type it out, benpernick@gmail.com. And if anybody else has any other questions, you can also feel free to ask in the chat. But
I also, Ben, I really want to thank you for doing this program. I think that doing programs like this really helps with awareness about anti-Semitism, about racism. That's one of the reasons why I continue to do programs like this.
well, thanks. I mean, it means a lot to me. You know, it's that we got to have this, because I think for me, it's always been important to, you know, share a story. You know, growing up, I think a lot of people who are Jewish have dealt with anti-Semitism here and there, maybe comments that someone made in school, or, but I think it's one of those things where I think a lot of, especially American Jews, maybe because we aren't as strongly connected as a whole to our Jewish identity as people were back in the villages in, you know, in Poland, where it was such a big part of your life. I think a lot of people feel, oh, well, it's not going to affect me. But I think ultimately everyone's affected, because even if you're, I mean, a lot of people even, you know, in the camps, it didn't matter how religious you were, but it's just what your background is. And I think it's just something, not a religious thing. It's a moral thing where we just need to do more. We need to step up to fight hate. And I think part of that is, it can't always be negatively focused. Sometimes we need to just take an honest look back and see if we can learn anything. Thank you. I definitely, yes, I mean, that's a good point. Julie says sometimes dumb luck is divine providence. I think that was definitely true. I didn't even go so much into the different, like all the different like miracles that happened that enabled him to survive. But I think a lot of it came down to him in one way or another. Just he did consider himself so he was a fighter, and he always clung very strongly to his faith. So I think he would probably believe it was divine providence. I mean, the one thing that he says to him, it wasn't a Holocaust story, his story, because there were so many people, religious people, moral people, strong, strong young people, where there was no escape from their circumstances, where they didn't have this luck or providence or what have you, and no matter what they did, there was no way around it, where they were going to go to the death camps, unfortunately. And I think when he talks about the Holocaust, that's what it was, that it didn't matter who you were. And I think that's why we need to really, right now, while we still have a functioning, or at least mostly somewhat functioning democracy. I mean,
yeah.
I think we're at a crossroads, and I think, he would probably say that some of the things he did, like for instance, when he was about to get sent to Auschwitz because he fell unconscious while he was supposed to be pulling a switch for a train, but he was already, fainting all the time because he was so malnourished. And they were going to send him to the camps because he, caused a crash. They told him, you better wash up and get back here. And he said, well, I guess I must have washed up well, because that was what, saved him. So I think there were definitely cases where him just trying to do everything he could, the best he could, helped him. But a lot of it, whether you want to call it luck or providence, it was just, if he didn't survive, I wouldn't be here to share this story. And there was so many people who probably had at least stories that for a lot of it were incredible, but that never got to be told, because in the end, they just didn't make it. I mean, I think there are definitely some great movies that portray that. but I think we need to, for the stories that we do have, we need to keep sharing them.
Alice Pernick says, I hope you will find a way to share this story with high school groups. I agree there's not enough Holocaust education going on. And Ruth Pernick says he used to speak to college students and high school students all the time. He started speaking in the early 1970s when nobody wanted to hear about it.
And I think that in itself is another great point, because I think a lot of people, it's true, they didn't want to hear about it. It's not an American story. It's not a positive, upbeat story of American heroism, and much more a story of kind of cowardice until the very end, of not wanting to get involved. And I mean, right now, around the world, there have been photographic evidence that there is forced labor camps of Uyghur Muslims in China. We think that there's definitely concentration camps in North Korea. And ultimately, a lot of it is the same, where people don't want to hear about it. They don't want to focus on it. They say, well, we can't get involved. I think even after this whole thing, it's an uphill battle. People aren't eager to hear about this. It's a depressing subject, and it makes people uncomfortable because it makes them realize that nobody is immune to propaganda. I mean, what happened there can happen here, and right now it's on a trajectory where it's increasingly seeming like a possibility. I think if we said 4 years ago that there would be, camps where, people were being separated from their families, things where politicians were openly, speaking out against minorities and getting more popular as a result, I think we wouldn't have believed that that could happen. But it's a gradual process, and we need to continue to fight, or else the forces of hate will end up winning.
I completely agree with you.
And I got to say, I am glad that Steven Spielberg actually did interview different families who had survived the Shoah, and he did interview my grandparents, which I know I actually haven't gotten to see the full interviews yet, but I will very soon, because I think it's just getting to see a video of them again will be very powerful. And I think that was an act by Steven Spielberg, just to have it on record, have people tell their stories while they were still living. And right now it's harder because a lot of those people are no longer still living, and generally stories, they get lost. It's very easy to let things get lost to the past. So I think everybody needs to find what they can do to try to learn more, to try to get more involved, and to try to spread that knowledge.
I completely agree with you. Do you know where those archives will be available?
If you email me about them, I will have that info, because I'm not entirely sure if that was something that was public or if it was something that was sent to us, but I am hoping to, at the very least, do more programs where, I can help educate on that. Sorry, that's.
I'll be done soon. Sorry, they're trying to kick me out of here. But no, I'd be very interested in that. And Alice Pernick says in the chat, there's a 3-volume memoir by Victor Klemperer, who was a German married to a Jew. It shows how Germany gradually devolved into a fascist country. I'd be very interested in that. But sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a great point. And he talks about early in the book, like, there were periods of peace, there were periods of calm where, like, one thing would happen and it would seem kind of scary, but then things would be fine. And then all of a sudden there would be some rule that would be put, and suddenly things were tougher. I think in a similar way, I think a lot of us have, if you think of how much outrage there would be at a single item of news in 2016 about something terrible that happened. Now we just say, throw it on the pile. even there's almost nothing too ridiculous where we just don't say, another day. And unfortunately, that's part of a fascist strategy, to just overwhelm you with outrage until you just kind of have a sense of hopelessness.
Yeah.
And I think we need to have hope. We need to find inspiration, to try to find more unity, and to support each other so that we don't end up falling prey to that.
I think that's a good note to end things on. But I just want to thank you again, Ben, so much from the bottom of my heart. Thank you for sharing your grandfather's story with me. It was truly an honor to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, everyone, for attending.
Great job, Ben.
Thank you.
Really, really important to hear.